del Centro de Modelamiento Matemático de la Universidad de Chile. Hoy tenemos en esta sesión, tenemos a la doctora Dorothy White, que nos va a presentar su trabajo titulado When Cultures Collide, Preparing to Teach Mathematics to Culturally Diverse Students. La doctora White es una profesora de educación matemática de la Universidad de Georgia. Ella enseña cursos de pregrado para docentes en formación en enseñanza, para docentes en formación que enseñarán matemáticas en educación básica y cursos de posgrado sobre problemas críticos y tendencias de educación STEM. Su investigación se centra en el acceso, la equidad y la cultura en la educación matemática, las comunidades profesionales de aprendizaje para docentes y el desarrollo profesional de profesores y educadores de matemáticas. Ella tiene un PhD en instrucción y currículum con especialidad en educación matemática de la Universidad de Maryland College Park, un magíster en educación matemática del Teacher College de Columbia University y una licenciatura en matemáticas de Morgan State University. I'm gonna also do the intro in English to include everybody. And so Dr. Dorothy White is a professor of mathematics education at the University of Georgia. She teaches undergraduate teacher preparation courses in early childhood and middle school mathematics education and graduate courses in critical issues and national trends in STEM education. Her research centers on access, equity, and culture in mathematics education, teachers' professional learning communities, and the professional development of mathematics teachers and educators. She holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction with specialty in mathematics education from University of Maryland College Park, an MA in mathematics education from Teacher College Columbia University, and a BS in mathematics from Morgan State University. And so, ahora le voy a dejar a la doctora White para que ella pueda comenzar su presentación. Y insisto, muchas gracias a todos por venir. Now I'm gonna let Dr. White start her presentation, and thank you everyone for coming.
Yes. Thank you, Dario. It is a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Elena, for also having me and hosting me. I apologize for not knowing how to speak Spanish. It is something that I'm working on, and one day I'll be able to do this entirely in Espanol. But for now, I'm going to do it in English. And I just want to share that I am not considering this a research talk. I'm considering this a conversation with colleagues. And so I would like to share some of my thinking where I am. And given that this is a nice body of researchers, I look forward to learning a lot from you through this presentation. So I have my slides, but there is a point in this session that I really am going to pluck your brains. So I hope you share freely and openly. All right, let's see, make sure the slides work. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Dario said, great. The title of my presentation is When Cultures Collide, Preparing to Teach Mathematics to Culturally Diverse Students. And the reason that this is dear to my heart is that as a person of color in the United States, it is often difficult to find your culture in educational spaces, whether it is in teacher education or in pre-K-12 classrooms. Not all students feel that they culturally belong. And so I've been working on this project in many different ways for several years. And it is a pleasure to share where I am thinking right now. So I want to begin with definitions. In mathematics, we love definitions. So when I looked up collision, a collision is considered an encounter between particles such as atoms or molecules resulting in exchange or transformation of energy. And I thought that was interesting because this talk is really about what happens in classrooms that I am considering collisions. Usually there's a saying that we say that you're on a collision course, meaning that if two or more people or groups are on a collision course, they are doing or saying things that would cause a disagreement or problems between them. And in this talk, I'm really arguing that when classroom cultures don't work well together, that is, whether it's the teacher's culture not being being congruent with the students' cultures or very different student cultures in the classrooms, that's a place where there could be cultural collisions. And so my quest is to find out how can we disrupt or avoid these collisions before they happen. So this talk is really about some of the work that I'm doing with prospective teachers to get them aware of these type of collisions and what they look like and what they will do. So the data is pretty, so I wanna say that the slide before, 2 RAMs, I don't think many classrooms have that type of collision. I think collisions in classrooms, I see them more like this, because there, as you can see, there's a big truck and a small car, that there's a hierarchy in classrooms. I'm gonna say the teacher is the big truck and the students are the small cars. The difference is that there are 25 small cars. So they can do damage too. But in classrooms, cultural collisions are when things collide. And so what does that mean for someone who is learning to be a teacher of mathematics? And what does that mean for researchers and teacher educators who are preparing students to avoid these type of collisions in the classroom? So when I talk about collisions, I think the causes of some of the collisions in mathematics classrooms are, and there's research to support this, the changing demographics in schools. Schools are changing, and so that's creating potential collisions. It's also a collision when teachers aren't aware of the ways in which culture influences mathematics teaching and learning. If teachers, and many of them do, start their teacher preparation programs or are practicing teachers and believe that mathematics is this culture-free content area, then they are unaware of the influences of math teaching and learning in real time, in real spaces with real people. And therefore a collision can occur. And then finally, another cause of the collision is that teacher preparation programs are not preparing teachers to work in culturally diverse classrooms. And while we're making progress in the US in our teacher preparation programs, it is not something that is done uniformly or with purpose and intention. And so these are the causes for the collisions. Notice that I really don't have pre-service teachers on this list because they're not quite teachers yet, and they're no longer in pre-K classrooms, but I'm looking at them as being somewhere in the middle. And so let's talk about, in this session, I want to give you just an overview of some of the trends in US schools and teacher preparation to sort of set the context about what this looks like. I want to give you a description of a project called Come Up, which is, I'm going to define where this data is coming from. And then I want to share some preliminary findings of what I'm calling classroom collisions and share my wonderings and questions and really open it up for ideas and suggestions on where to go with this work. So if you're with me, let's take this journey with no collisions. So look at the trends. So in the US, public schools in the United States are becoming more diverse. We're also having more charter schools and more private schools, but these schools are also becoming more diverse. We also know that the number of Black and Hispanic students, English language learners, and students living in poverty in the US has also increased. This is pre-COVID. What we will learn after COVID is really going to tell us a lot about whether our school systems are really serving anyone And if so, in what way? But at the same time as the demographics in schools are changing, the teaching population is pretty stable. It's about 84% white. So let's look at some data to see. For example, according to the Condition of Education's latest study, teachers in public elementary school are predominantly male and female. Male and female, sorry, not predominantly. But as you can see, there's a predominance of female teachers, right? And this is pretty stable across. Now, the difference is that in pre-K-12 schools, the demographics of the students by gender is really 50-50. We're seeing the data that's about 49% female, 51% male. So we have a conflict or potential conflict when you have the majority of our teachers being females. So males aren't seeing themselves represented in classrooms. At the secondary level, we have a little more leveling off, but we still have the majority of teachers being female at the elementary and middle school levels. When we see teachers, the distribution, again, 84% white, 8% of the teachers are Black, 9% are Hispanic. So while we are seeing small movement when it comes to the race and ethnicity of our teachers, it's not by much. Now let's look at students. If we look at students in our US schools, this is from pre-kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, we notice that there are larger numbers of Black and Hispanic students in schools in comparison to the number of teachers. So we see that there is this different, and this trend is growing. Our English language learners are also growing in numbers. And there are very different languages that are in place in schools, but as we see, this is growing. What's a little disturbing is that we're seeing less when we get into the high school levels, which is suggesting that not all students are actually getting or going beyond elementary. And so that's something that's potentially a problem. Finally, we see that our students living in poverty, we have 45% of students in 1990 to 2000 living in poverty. The percentage of students with low poverty is 24, high poverty is now 20%. So we're seeing a rise in students living in poverty. Dr. Gonzalez was nice enough to find some data from Chile to also look at this trend, right? So as we see, when we look at mujeres, we have more, and that number is pretty stable, but it mirrors a lot of the US data when it comes to who is in the teaching profession. We look at data on students. We notice, again, similar to US data in the sense that it's about 50-50, about half female, half male. And that doesn't match with what we see in our teacher population. When it comes to data on ethnicity, we have this table here that is looking at the number of students and where they are, and in particular, the number of students who are from Chile, students who are speakers of English, of Spanish, sorry. And so I'm not gonna go beyond that data. Daria, if you wanna add anything, you just sent me that data, please feel free. But I think the data sort of speaks well about looking at the trends on who's in our classrooms.
Yeah, especially that like at the lower left bottom corner, that 4.5% of students are foreign students in Chile, which is a number increased significantly since the early 2000s in Chile. So it's a very sizable population of students that now come from other countries, and not all those countries also have Spanish as their main language.
Yes. So again, looking at where students are coming from, where people are coming from, immigration patterns in Chile, right? If you have students who are coming from Spanish-speaking countries, it does not mean the dialect and all of that is the same. It's different, it's cultural. And as cultures, we have different ways of doing, but you also have a larger number of students from Haiti, which are not Spanish speakers for the most part. And so that can really cause a collision in the classroom when we think about being able to find yourself in that classroom or see yourself in that mathematics classroom. So just wanted to give just a sort of snapshot, and it's been nice to see how the similarities in the US and Chile are here when it comes to populations of teachers and gender. So because of this change in demographic in US schools, in mathematics education, this is particularly important because we continue to have a differential achievement gap among students in schools. And so just looking at some of the data, when we look at, for example, how well students are doing, we see these gaps here. The blue line being our white students who are making up about 60% of the population, but are still doing in proportion to their numbers are not doing, students who are Black and Hispanic are not doing well in comparison. When we also look a little deeper, peel back the onion, in mathematics, we're looking at in high school courses, what are people taking with respect to classes? Are they taking enough mathematics classes to really be prepared for careers in STEM, for example? So while it looks like on this side of the N, it looks like everyone is taking classes in most US schools. It's mandatory that people take 4 credits. But when we look over here, those in the engineering and computer science or information science are still not being represented well. They're pretty similar, but still, it's not a good thing. When we look even further, one more peel back of the onion, and we see what those credits are in, now we're going to see major gaps. So for example, if we look at below algebra, or if we look at algebra 2, we can see that a lot of students, but then take a look at calculus. Our Asian students are taking a lot more calculus classes, which are, as we know, precursors for careers in a lot of the engineering or STEM classes. And so that's problematic in that this number from 45 here, and then we have Black and Hispanic students at only 6 and 10%, that means that we are squandering the talent of those students. The solutions that we need in this world to solve real problems are being limited because not all students are at the table to give us information that we need to make changes in the world. So for me, it's problematic. And again, we have this, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but as our advanced placement courses, we see this trend as well. So where are we in teacher preparation? In the US, we have very different teacher preparation type programs. We have traditional, which is the majority of our teacher candidates are in traditional programs. We have alternative programs, and alternative programs, for example, can be people who are have a degree in another content area, such as mathematics, and they decide to be a teacher or English. And then we have alternative programs that are not in higher education, and they might be school districts can have programs to get people into teaching. Note that again, our teacher candidates, our prospective teachers, are still overwhelmingly female in all types of programs. When we look at race and ethnicity programs, we see that a large number of our programs, the students in our program, are white. So that trend that I brought up earlier about teachers and who they are, it doesn't look like that trend is going to change if we start looking at who's even going into teacher education. And so that's a topic for another study, but just to show that the context of teacher education is still going to be predominantly white as our classrooms become more and more diverse. And so potential collisions when teachers don't share cultural values or even see the necessity. Last slide is that if we look at the enrollment in schools are increasing, yet the enrollment in teacher preparation programs is decreasing, which means we're going to have fewer teachers and have so many implications for that. So we have to do something about that. And those that are, we need to know this is something that they should pay attention to. And in the field of mathematics education, this is not new about the role of culture. Bishop talked about this in 2001. And the importance of creating these ways, Nasir and Han, is that mathematics classrooms either support or constrain different forms of knowledge. And unfortunately, when we look at whose forms of knowledge, it's often the teachers or students who share their race or culture. And therefore, preparing teachers to build on students' math and cultural backgrounds is an opportunity for math teacher educators to expose pre-service teachers. I am taking on the role of a teacher educator that recommends, according to the standards for math teacher preparation, that we need to prepare teachers before they go out to teach. We need to give them opportunities to learn about and build on multiple mathematical, cultural, linguistic, and family strengths that students bring to the classroom. And I'm going to argue that is across cultures, it is across continents, right? Every student brings something to the classroom. Every student has strengths. And this is the foundation that I want my students as potential teachers to understand. And in teacher preparation, we've done a really good job with the mathematical side of this. We've been talking about mathematics, but it is a difference between teaching mathematics and teaching students mathematics. And I want my students to understand, my potential teachers to understand that. So let's get at how we're doing this. Well, I'm not the only one. Several researchers in the field of math education have been trying to bring pre-service teachers on board with this. And while other fields have taken this on, for example, social studies has been doing this work because they prepare citizens or history. And we have language arts who have been looking at bringing this in. Mathematics and science are fields that are still slow at creating these spaces and making this something that we do as teacher educators in our teacher preparation program. And so this field is young, but not too young. It's not new, it's just young, and it's time for more. And so I want to share the Cultural Awareness Mathematics Project and where this study is going. All right, so before I continue, are there any questions? I'm not good at looking at the chat right now, so if everyone is okay, I'm going to keep going, but just giving it a pause. Ready? All right. I want to begin by my definition of culture. I think a lot of times we talk about culture without really defining it. And so I want to share what I use, which is Marshall's definition. I define culture as the consistent ways in which people experience, interpret, and respond to the world around them. It represents the ways of being of a collective. It is different than just an identity. identities we form, and I think of culture as things that we are born into, not born with. Cultures are a feature of all human groups and is shaped by historical, social, political, economic, and even geographical factors. And this is very important in the US because for a lot of our white pre-service teachers, they don't believe that they have a culture, they believe that everyone else has a culture. And the problem with that is everyone else can see their culture but them. And so if you can't see yourself as understanding that all human groups have a culture, then therein lies one of the problems in being ready to teach culturally diverse students. And then finally, as culture is reinforced through context with social institutions, such as places of worship and schools. Schools enculturate students into what it means to learn and be good at mathematics. It enculturates them in what it means to have your ideas and thoughts valued or respected or invalidated or seen as not important. And so schools have a culture too. And we live in this space of multiple cultures that we change and move freely in, but we rarely can think about it unless we are being asked. Culture is learned. It rarely changes quickly. Through conscious and unconscious resistance, we tend to defend our culture. And our own cultural ways of being strike us as ordinary, usual, and normal. And consequently, we are often oblivious to the other cultures. And this happens in mathematics education. And finally, it is not uncommon for other people's cultural ways of being to strike us as quaint, strange, or even pathological. And that becomes very problematic in a classroom space, because if teachers are viewing the students as this other culture, the norm that they set for students determines whether students can feel like this is a place that I can learn freely, or is it a place that I have to give up some of my cultural identity to be successful? And so the Come Up project is really designed to think about these ideas of culture is learned, it really changes, people defend it, in teacher preparation. How do we continue to do this and help them? And I would argue that in order for us to do this, we have to disrupt our teachers' thinkings about culture in general in order to help them think about students. I don't think we can do it by just having them talk about students only. So the culture awareness Come Up is based on a unit that was designed for a mathematics methods course. And this course is a teacher preparation course, and the unit has 3 goals. Was to 1, to help pre-service teachers develop an understanding of the role of culture. To understand that stereotypes about who can and can do mathematics is a thing that we all are enculturated into thinking about, and also to help them create strategies to teach mathematics to all students. When I first started in teacher preparation, I was one of those people that thought that pre-service teachers needed to be told how to think about diverse students. At the same time, I lectured them and I told them how you have to get to know your students, that students should be the center of your classrooms, yet I was not living in that way. Instead, I was that teacher in that space, believing that these students were culturally deficient when it came to understanding students who are different than them. The cultural awareness unit was designed for me to step back as a teacher educator to 1, start with where are students or pre-service teachers in their thinking about culture? What are these stereotypes and how do we disrupt them? And then what strategies can we co-create in the classroom? The unit had 3 components. It started with having the pre-service teachers research an article that addresses teaching or learning students who are culturally different than them. And this was very important because it allowed them to sort of give us a window of how they were seeing culture in general. We did not have a discussion about it. I didn't talk about it. And I just said, find something that's culturally different than you. That gave them a place when we have a discussion, which was next, of knowing. So they were able to talk in either terms of themselves or in terms of the article. But more importantly, they were talking. And so we had a class discussion where they begin by sharing their article, and then we talk about what does it mean, what does culture mean, what's culture in math classrooms, and more recently, what does it mean to belong or feel othered in a classroom? Afterwards, they write a reflection on how they felt, what are they thinking about culture, and we designed it to sort of see movements. Cam Up was this project that White and Dr. Gonzalez is also on this paper that we wrote, which will give you all of the ins and outs of the project. But Cam Up was born from this project. And in particular, I wanted to study whether this unit could be replicated in other teacher preparation programs, what changes might need to happen in different contexts, and the impact on pre-service teachers' ability to teach culturally responsive. So Cam Up is a bigger project that is a cross-site study, and the unit is what we do in these three spaces. And so the cross-site is with three different types of universities. In particular, in the US, we have different universities. One is the University of Georgia, and it is considered a predominantly white institution. The majority of the students are white. It has always been white that way, and it was designed. And at the University of Georgia, for example, Black students only have been in attendance for 60 years. We are celebrating 60 years of the first Black actually attending the University of Georgia, even though it was founded in 1785. So when I teach my critical issues course, I want them to understand that in 1785, my people were slaves. And so understanding that generations there were only 60 years being at this university and less for faculty. That's one of the sites. The second site is Morgan State University, which is a historically Black college and university, which was designed in the US for Black people to be able to get an education. And then the last site is Texas State University, which is a Hispanic serving institution. It started as a PWI, and it moved into a Hispanic serving institution based on enrollments. Unfortunately, while the student body is large numbers of Hispanic students, teacher education is still predominantly white. So we have these different types, and we're looking at it. In this wondering session, where I'm going to take you with the collisions, is not a part of the big study. I'm just going to zero in on the PWI site, which is Georgia, and my pre-service teachers and the wonderings I have with them. So if you think about this, it was one addition to the project based on looking at this, and that is we also have them do a math autobiography. And I think many teacher preparations do math autobiographies in their classes, but we added a question. Were most students in your math class of the same ethnicity, race, gender, or linguistic or socio background as you? Did this change over time, and if so, how? It has been very interesting to get to learn about our teacher candidates by asking them this question. Many of them will start thinking about the trends that they experienced. For example, sometimes most of them were in very white settings. And then as they progressed through the grades, it got more diverse. Others have never been in diverse settings. And so when we think about how do we prepare them for diverse students, being at the University of Georgia might be their first experience with diverse students. And then being in classrooms might be their first experience with students. And then some people don't answer this question at all, which is also very interesting. That's a different study. But what I want to talk about in this talk is potential collisions. So as I said earlier, I think one of the collisions that have potential is that when the teacher does not share the cultural background of the students or does not see the role of culture in teaching and learning. And so I've been looking at this cultural collisions. So I am going to ask you to be kind because these data are very new. And I have not finished data analysis at all. In the CAMUP study, we're looking at the cross sites a little differently. So this is a new field. And so I look forward to learning about this. So some of the preliminary findings is when we ask pre-service teachers about their views on culture, they usually think of culture in ways of culture as race, culture as nationality, culture as socio and economic status, and culture as language acquisition. And they tend to reflect very dominant narratives of culture in contemporary US, right? So African Americans feel a certain way, or people from Asia are just good in math. And so their views are poor students can't learn because they don't have resources. All of these are very dominant deficit views that our pre-service teachers come to. And the one that I am looking at in particular in this space for this session is really culture as language acquisition. So what I mean by that is that students would select articles and they would write that the culture in the article are English language learners. If I did that in Chile, they might say that they were Spanish language learners or Spanish learners. And so this idea of seeing that has been a potential collision. And I'm going to share some data to show you why I think these are collisions, but also to get your thinking about this. I'm lending and working on this idea that pre-service teachers view home language from a difference rather than a resource as a problem. And Leva and his colleagues talked about we need pre-service teachers to think of language as a resource for thinking because it is linked to identity and a mathematical thinking identity and fluency. And it is an explicit way to challenge this isolation of learning mathematics as something impersonal and irrelevant. So I'm building on that idea of language is not something to fix the kids with. Language is a research to draw upon. And they also argue that in equity-based math teaching practices, especially in the context of multilingual students, the valuing of other languages such as Spanish is crucial for the inclusion of students' lives, experiences, culture, and knowledge. Deeming one's family language as an obscenity or as an area of self that needs to be silenced, hidden, or erased undermines the human right that we all have to embrace and appreciate our own identity. This is problematic in mathematics classrooms. As a math educator, I believe that all students should see themselves and their identities, both their multilingual identities and their mathematical identities as places in classrooms where they are valued and respected. So my collisions start by reading some of the papers that our students turn in particular, some of their article critiques. One, they talk about this in ways, English is my first language and I have a little background with Spanish. I personally have never had to deal with a teacher teaching in a language different from the one used at home. What stands out for me is the phrase deal with. deal with is problematic. So it already gives us a hint that there is something that's just hard. Another one is coming from a white middle-class Christian home. My own culture is generally the one most supported in US public schools, at least in the South. Never having been a student in a classroom where my culture was not the norm, it is hard for me to imagine, one second. It is hard for me to imagine the way that students get the adverse experiences. My husband is at my door, okay. Thank you. We have to love trying to do this at home on Zoom. But never having been a student in a classroom, my culture was not the norm. It is hard for me to imagine the way the students who get the adverse experience learn differently. I picked these two quotes because this is very common in their conversations when they talk about students who don't speak English as their first language. They see this as something that students have to deal with and that they can't imagine it. It's a good thing or a bad thing. It's good because the culture unit is designed to get them to imagine it. The other part is this idea of what does it mean to imagine? And as the teacher educator and a researcher, what does it mean to imagine it, right? Are there situations and experiences that we can give them that they can start imagining it? So I have my question here. And I really wanted to split you into 3 groups to take on these different quotes. And in particular, these are the way pre-service teachers are thinking about these ideas. So I really want to stop for a moment and give people a chance to read either 1, 2, or 3, and then open up a conversation about what are you noticing in this? What are some ways to think about disrupting that? Because I see all 3 of these, that if teachers go into classrooms feeling this way, and these classrooms are culturally diverse, then there will be cultural collisions. And those collisions will hinder students' mathematics learning. So I am going to stop and I'm going to let you read. 2 minutes. All right, I gave you a little more than 2 minutes. My challenge is if you would type something in the chat, and the first thing I want you to type is, which of the 3 students made you pause the most? And I'm not going to ask you to press return until everyone has had a chance to type. So please type something in the chat about which of these 3, student A, student B, or student C, gave you the most pause, as this is a potential collision in the classroom. Ready? You can type now, but don't press return. We're going to have a shower of responses. All right, please press return. So what's nice is that there is a mix of responses. So if anyone would, what is it about these responses? And I'm going to be mindful of time. What is it about these responses that make you see this as, hopefully I do, as a potential collision? And I don't know the best way to do this other than unmic, and let's take it. There we go, that's our timer. There, you're unmuted. I'm going to help with this.
Can I don't want to don't want to interrupt something, but were you calling for someone to explain their thoughts?
Yes, please.
I personally picked student A. The thing that struck me the most were some phrases. The view that African American ELLs and AAEs are groups who suffer greatly, and later in that same phrase, the view that the students spoke a language that is inherently closer from the materials later studied in schools.
Yes.
The view that I am closer to that than them, that I see as potentially a problem.
Yes, I do too, Benjamin. This problem of what does it mean to this barrier? So what stood out for me is this barrier that she never faced. And so thank you for sharing that information.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on A? Let's do A, then B, then C. Anyone else want to share something on A? And if not, we can go to B. Benjamin is not alone, so as I tell my students, I know who you are now because you put something in the chat. So. What are your thoughts on B?
I can talk a little bit about B.
Mm-hmm.
In the last part of the write-up, it seems like they're saying that they first need to comprehend the language and then they can comprehend mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's striking. I think it's interesting that they put one thing before the other instead of seeing them as together.
Yes, one of the things that I learned from the cross site, and being honest, when I used to see these responses, I didn't see the inherent collision in them, right? That, oh, they just want to help students, right? If they don't have the vocabulary, that's just it. But what my co-PIs helped me with is really understanding that that's not seeing language as a resource at all, right? It is something that, like you said, Eric, once I teach them the vocabulary, then I can teach them mathematics. That you can't somehow do it together, or that the vocabulary, or worse yet, I'm gonna sort of like see, is that if you don't speak English, you can't even think about using mathematics in your life. Salome? Thanks, Eric.
Salomé,
Salome has a hand
si te
raised.
puede. Sí.
Perdón. Ahí. Dorothy, I wanted to point out something that struck me about all of the, and maybe it was the setting, but none of them say anything positive about the different cultures. So they see it as a deficit, right? They say,
yes,
problem because of this and that. And in all of them, this struck me, I mean, this was very surprising. They don't see as a possibility of enrichment for the class, I think.
Yes.
As a problem and I think this is quite surprising somehow, since one should think that in the US at least there will be more appreciative, right, of thinking maybe these students will have a new, how can I say, they may be interested in new problems. So they all kind of think, at least the first one and the last one, in all this type of, how can I say, the word problems, for instance, the classical word problems. So I think it's, to me, it was very surprising to kind of see that they start thinking about the problems or the deficit and not as a resource maybe, or as a maybe think about that math should be taught in a different way. I mean, right?
Right. I see the same thing. Or that it's the student's problem.
Yeah, of course.
Or like see our, right? This whole, there is this our, and that's why this culture part of it is so important. You know, it's different from ours. Like, who's the our?
Yes,
if
exactly.
The students are American and just happen to speak this whole who really is American, and that I think for me this last one and see, it's easier for us to see math around us, and I just
it's easier for us. Yes.
Yes. So this idea that these things are not something that is a human experience. And that becomes very problematic. On the other side of this, and I am mindful of time, is that this was the article critiques. So this was this was before we had a discussion.
Right.
And I don't have data because the data, well, we have data, it's just not analyzed to really see changes. But over time, just in our first pass, we see some change. But it's clear that one class is not enough. And it is clear that those experiences are actually showing up when they're working with students in our program, which is very problematic, right? Because it's a math methods course, and the tension is there is, at the same time, I need you to teach you about how students are thinking about fractions, right? Or decimals or geometry, and how these cultural things come in. And so a lot of teacher educators are opting, well, we don't have time for that. But there is a problem when we don't ask this question, right? Which is, let's just ask them what they're interested in. So on the one hand, a lot of them decide, I'm interested in this because I know the classrooms are changing, and I will probably have some in my classroom, some. but it is, as Rochelle Gutierrez talks about, is this dehumanizing factor that comes in. And even good stereotypes. So we talk about in the discussion these ideas of who's good at math, who's bad at math, and how a lot of them will say, well, Asians are good at math. But what does that even mean to just create a person? Nirul Shah talks a lot about this in his work, about just you're this entity, like a human computer. What does it mean for a classroom when you have students who are Asian American who don't feel good at math? And it's interesting that sometimes they're in the classroom and they talk about that feeling of how teachers experience, how they experience math. I have to end, unless there are other final thoughts. I have a couple more slides as we go until 6:30, right? I know. So let me, my wonderings and questions, these are them. I'm wondering what are some ideas I should think about this. I'm wondering what kinds of experiences do we need to really disrupt that? I am liking a lot of the work by with translanguaging and this importance of building on that, and then the different frameworks to guide this work. And I want to leave you with a couple of things. I'm encouraged by this one student's quote, that by the end of this, she realized math is culturally biased. It benefits students who speak the dominant language in the classroom and often leaves students of other cultural backgrounds to struggle. As educators, it is our responsibility to create a space where all students feel valued in the subject, not just strong English speakers. Teaching math is so much more than just numbers. It's teaching a language that has an opportunity to be universal, as long as every student is considered and genuinely included in the process. So I am encouraged by this movement in this student's reflection of where do we go from here? In closing, I have you, sorry, I have your faces on my screen. I think as math teacher educators, we want pre-service teachers to realize that classroom cultures that they create are co-constructed. Our literature on classroom cultures are there. It's co-constructed with their students and families, with mathematics curriculum, and their own ways of being enculturated into mathematics education. Part of the unit is also helping them think about, how did you learn mathematics? We often teach the way we were taught. And a big collision that I am learning now is the collision of the pre-service teachers who are seeing math curriculum as things to check off, skills that kids need, and not really concepts that they build upon and need to understand. We also want to help pre-service teachers avoid collisions and see their interactions with students as dynamic opportunities of learning. That's the space, that's the classroom. It's not the deliverer. So we're still at that point that we are seeing them as the deliverer. They are seeing themselves as they're going to deliver information to children and not learn from them. And so how do we get them into that space of learning is part of being a teacher? And you learn not just from books, but from your classes and your students. Math teacher educators must help pre-service teachers acknowledge and challenge their views while they are still in teacher preparation programs. Only then will we develop pre-service teachers' cultural consciousness, enabling to build safe cultural spaces for students to learn mathematics. And I leave you with a quote from Barack Obama in his latest book, which reads, "For I'm convinced that the pandemic we're currently living through is both a manifestation of and a mere interruption in the relentless march toward an interconnected world, one in which peoples and cultures can't help but collide. In that world, we will learn to live together, cooperate with one another, and recognize the dignity of others, or we will perish." Gracias.
Thank you, Dr. White, for the presentation. Muchas gracias, Dr. White, por la presentación. Tenemos algunas preguntas. Y si alguien con las preguntas necesita un poco de ayuda con la traducción, nos puede avisar y nosotros podemos traducir para la doctora White en inglés. We have a couple of questions.
Awesome.
And if some people need like translation, I can translate, or Elena can help me translate questions for you, Dr. White.
Sounds great.
Maybe we can do the raising hand.
Stop sharing.
Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, pueden levantar la manito o desmutearse también. Okay. Fabiola.
Yes, hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about how to deal with colleagues, for instance, who do not think they're racist, but they're saying things inherently racist. I speak from a gender perspective with people who are machistas, but do not think that. So how do you deal with that experience?
I think the challenge is the first one, and being, I deal with that experience a lot in very multiple spaces, right? In the academy in particular. Being the first African-American female ever hired has been interesting. And so over the years of helping people understand is part of it, but it can also be exhausting. So I have learned to, one, be very clear about my intention in trying to fix people. Two, what is it that I want? Do I want you to stop making these comments? Is that what we're after? Do I want them to see how what they're doing is harmful? I'm very clear about my intention when I engage in that space, because there's a lot of other work to do. I'm also very clear about how limited power I have in changing people's minds, right? And so sometimes it is an experience that they need that I can't give them, but someone else might be able to. Right, so I've started, we can read books, we can talk about that, but that human side of it is important. And I think people don't often realize that hurt and comments hurt. There's a pain, there's a toll for that, and that no one gets to do that. So I've had individual talks with people when they make comments in meetings. I've had not so nice comments when people make comments in meetings. But again, self-care is important because you have to protect your spirit as well. And so I don't know if that helps much, but for me,
Yeah,
it helps to think about.
It does actually. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Sometimes say, I was only joking, and you try to explain to them, and yeah, but
yes, it wasn't. Yeah, and that's a lot of people say I was only joking, but was it funny? You know, so sometimes just help. I like to come back with a question like, help me. I didn't see it. I didn't find it funny. Maybe I didn't get it, right? That usually doesn't go over well with that person. They like to just say, oh, you don't understand. You're right. That's why I ask questions. I don't understand.
yeah.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Dario, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So, mi pregunta, primero quería hacer un comentario que encuentro que una forma de, I'm going to say in English later, encuentro que una forma de poder ayudar a los docentes en formación es que si ellos pueden ver ejemplos concretos de cómo matemática se puede hacer de formas diferentes en diferentes culturas, para mostrarle que matemática no es algo así universal, o que no tiene ninguna relación con la cultura, digamos, sino que es una actividad cultural, ya, igual que cualquier otra actividad humana. Y mi pregunta es, cuando se le está enseñando a los docentes de formación, ¿qué es lo más difícil para ellos o qué es lo que más les cuesta entender acerca del rol que tiene la cultura en aprender matemáticas? So my comment was that maybe one direction to go with the research is that maybe pre-service teachers need particular examples of how like math is done in different cultures, so they can see that culture actually influences mathematics, just like any other human activity. That would be my comment. My question is, like in your experience or what you are seeing in your data already, what is the most difficult thing for pre-service teachers to understand about how culture influences the learning and teaching of mathematics?
I think the most, going back to the different cultures, I want to hit that first. Martha Seville has a nice piece in the case book that I edited about exposing pre-service teachers in math classes to different ways of doing mathematics. And the response was, well, when do we teach them the right way or the US way? So that's a challenge. I think our biggest challenge in the data across sites, and these deficit views are across sites, which is really surprising. I think the hardest thing is convincing them that pre-service teachers, that they can actually make a difference. I don't think they really believe that the school and the curriculum is going to dictate what they have to do and how they have to do it. And if they don't follow that, like they see it as an add-on. And convincing them that that is not an add-on. That is just a way of teaching your students. Some of them, and so I try to connect with other content areas. So for language and reading, they are hearing a lot about making this culturally relevant for their students. And also, so I leverage that a lot. They want their students, they would never say, I want them to read and not understand. And so I try to use that idea of learning mathematics with understanding is important. And if you believe that in reading, that they have to experience it, that they have to see themselves, then math is no different. I think the hardest thing is getting them to be empowered. Earlier, I'd say about 7 years ago, I'd probably say the hardest thing was for them to see themselves as having a culture. I think they're getting better at knowing that, right? That they have a culture. They don't see anything wrong with it, but they have a culture. So I think that hurdle and that they're aware of. But the one about being empowered to change, they're not there yet.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, me neither.
Thank you, Dr. Wen.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask you something.
It's loose.
I know I'm sorry about my camera, but my home is a mess now. So yeah. I would like to ask you, what would you say to researchers who still think that race is not an issue, an important issue in mathematics education? So I am asking you this because particularly here in Latin America, it's very hard for researchers to acknowledge the centrality of race in processes of exclusion and marginalization and the fabrication of students in the mathematical class. So I would like to know, what would you say? What would you say to researchers particularly?
I think one of the challenges, and that's why I use culture as an entree, because race is included in culture, but it's not defining it. I think with researchers in particular, understanding that there are people in this world that can't engage fully with mathematics because of being denied who they are. And I've had a lot of people talk about, like, what would you give up to learn mathematics? And most of them think I wouldn't give up anything, right? And so, but every day when you have to give up something to learn mathematics, you are, right? So what is left of you? I think in a lot of spaces where people don't see race anymore, this color blindness is just harmful, right? Because we have colonialism, we have ways that we think and do mathematics that don't respect indigenous ways of thinking and doing, because we can't see them because we pretend they don't exist. So there's this whole wealth of knowledge that we are limiting ourselves to, whether it is in the research that we publish or it is in just the studies that we do that are not moving our field. So I've been trying to really push this. Are we moving our field with new frameworks, new ways of thinking? And that can only happen when we broaden our space and look beyond what currently is. And as you know, Luz, we worked on that the committee together. It is very hard convincing people that this is happening, especially at the publication level, right? With reviews, with reviewers, with editorial boards, with whose ways, with citations, who gets cited. All of these things are limiting us. So I don't have the best answer. I have just an answer about hoping to see that. So when people say, I'll say, well, I see it all the time. Are you curious? And I open the door that some people are curious. Some people just think, oh, that's you because you have to. It's like, it's you because I have to. I have to because of you, not always because of me, right? And it's really hard, but we have to continue to do it because it's necessary to move our field. We can't stay stagnated. So.
Thanks. Thank you.
Good. We'll keep working on it together.
Yeah, we have to.
Yes. Yeah. I think one way, just to add one last thing, I think another way is in our doctoral preparation, right? Are we including these issues in our preparation programs, right? Because we're enculturating them into being math researchers, math education researchers and teachers. In what way are we helping them think outside of the box? Mm-hmm. Eric, I see your hand.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to check on time. If I can.
You can ask your question.
Okay. I'll turn on my camera. Sorry, I'm in a t-shirt. I had a question about countries that really don't think a lot about race. So I have a lot of years of experience in the Philippines. We don't talk about race a lot because everyone looks the same. We're all Filipino. But we do talk a lot about poverty, and that public versus private schools are a big source of cultural inequities. Rich kids go to private schools, not rich kids go to public schools. And in fact, in the Philippines, they say, don't go to public schools because, you know, for certain cultural reasons that they're trying to avoid. I just want to ask you to comment on my comment. Your idea of culture is so broad, it's really good to think about the culture of the students. But I'm also thinking as teachers, shouldn't we also be activists? Because if we recognize that poverty is a problem that seeps into our math classrooms, shouldn't we also be activists to support, you know, lifting people out of poverty, which I think is like, it's difficult because you're a teacher, you're emotionally exhausted, and now you want me to fight for, you know, against poverty, but you know that will help you in class. And I think that might be an interesting space where we can think about, especially for countries that don't think a lot about race.
I think, and I know there was a time where we would do that. Thanks for your question there. I think asking teachers to fix the systemic poverty is problematic. I think asking teachers to understand that classrooms where there are a large number of students living in poverty are often impoverished, right? It is impoverished by the way we educate students, by the way we value what they bring to the table. And that is trauma inducing. And so these classroom spaces are real spaces. And how do we get them to first even recognize that poor people aren't broken people? Like that was one, I was gonna do two of the big themes, that poor people have no value, right? That's just crazy. So how do we get them to understand that? And I think part of it, that starts by then getting them out of communities or seeing kids. And then that works as activism. But I want to empower teachers to empower communities. And a lot of times when teachers take on activism, they want to be the person that's out in the front. And their role might not be out in the front. So what I want teachers, and you know, Eric, I do a lot of work with teachers, I want them to tell me about what resources they draw on from the parents of students. Because that's going to tell me a lot about how they're seeing these students. Well, they can't do anything, they work. What does that even mean? Right? Is working a bad thing, right? So it's this whole helping teachers get to that. And I think activism is going to be a big part of it. So yeah, and I think countries that try to pretend that we don't look at these things a lot, especially in the US and other countries, it's so nice to use poverty as an excuse, right? But part of it is also you're maintaining a system that's maintaining poverty, right? So how do we recognize it in those spaces is understanding that privilege that you have and how that privilege is also denying someone else or is oppression, right? And so yes and no, Eric.
That's a great education answer. It's both yes and no.
Yes, it is. So I have to be mindful because I can be very activist. And my activism is going into classrooms and fighting for the education of students. By helping teachers just see when they're not engaging all students. Why are the most difficult students always in the back of the room? Why are your best students in the front? I mean, that whole, like the best students are the ones that can actually be in the back because they're the best students. But that whole shift in these classrooms, that I think empowers them to be activists. And what does that mean? Mm-hmm.
Maybe we have some more time for one last question. Tal vez tenemos un poquito de tiempo para una última pregunta. Benjamin has a
Sorry,
question.
this may not be a proper question. It's just kind of an idea that has been lying around in my mind during the presentation. As far as I'm aware, which is not very much, there is some kind of research going on in a kind of neighboring subject, which is music education, where there has been acknowledged the phenomenon that some teachers think, or some musicians, or some teachers mainly think that music is kind of cultureless, that there's the same phenomenon that kind of tends to occur in mathematics. that after some period of this kind of mathematization of music, it became kind of this thing that it's perceived as cultureless or beyond, well, beyond culture, and so they tend to think of music as kind of, well, the same views are kind of drawn from the teachers about the music education, and so I was wondering if there was some kind of parallel between the two areas, or there was some kind of cross. Sorry, my English is not very good, but
doing great.
If Darío can help me out on this one, me preguntaba si es que la como investigación de un área, o sea, los académicos en un área de la educación han como mirado un poco qué es lo que se está haciendo en la otra para mejorar un poco la situación.
Okay. So Benjamin is asking whether you know if like researchers in different areas of education have seen into the other areas to see ways in which we could like you know, take on the challenge of teaching diverse. Like
yes. I think, I don't know about music education. I'm fascinated about what's going on there. Music in the US tends to be very racialized on what type of music, jazz is, you know, this or who does pop. But I look a lot at science education. And science education is sort of where, so this project, I have a part of it in science ed, where we do very similar things. And science is very hard to get them there because there are topics that they fundamentally don't believe in. And so like evolution or climate change. And so helping them understand that you are going to have to teach that anyway has been a challenge. We don't have that in mathematics. Our department at the university is now becoming, we just added social studies. And I'm fascinated in the work that they do because they do a lot of this advocacy, social justice work with issues around immigration and issues around citizenship. At the same time, there are people who only want to look at that area of work in social studies around history. It really becomes problematic because it is whose history is being taught in teacher preparation programs, whose history are being seen as valuable to even rise to the textbook. So, for example, in many US textbooks, there are students who are just never even featured in there, right? You just don't exist. I'll take Black students for one. So there was slavery, and then there was Martin Luther King. And then nothing happened in between that, right? We have in California, you still have to teach about how missions and doing what things to Native Americans, the internment camps that we had for Chinese Americans here in the country, how that doesn't make it to our history books. It's so problematic. So I think different fields have been taking it on. I don't know how well it's been going, but I think the synergy is there to start looking at it. I know that there's funding now available for STEAM, right? It's trying to do STEM teaching and the arts. And some people are connecting it with music or museums. I worry that the lens is still from a very predominantly Eurocentric lens that we're still doing. So that's problematic. when we're still trying to do this. But I have no idea, but it is something that I'm curious about now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and especially Dr. Y for presenting. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really enjoyed it. Quisiera agradecer a todos por haber venido. Muchísimas gracias, y en especial a la doctora White por su presentación. Realmente la disfrutamos mucho. Y tenemos también que hacer un anuncio, ¿verdad, Arina?
Sí, los queremos invitar a la próxima sesión de nuestro seminario de educación, que va a ser el día martes 4 de mayo. En dicha ocasión va a presentar el doctor Francisco Rodríguez. El tema es de el eje de datos y azar, un desafío pendiente en la formación inicial docente después de más de una década en el currículum escolar chileno. Así que los invitamos cordialmente en este mismo horario de 5:30 a 6:30 para que podamos escuchar otra investigación interesante en el área.
Gracias all.
Oh. Ok. Muchas gracias por venir también y nos estaremos viendo en una próxima ocasión. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful letting me be able to get some ideas. I have a lot of notes here.
Very interesting, your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dario, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White.
All right. Let me know if I need to do anything. I will talk to you on Sunday.
Absolutely. Take care. Take care.